Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The sun was not rising. It was burning its way down. Nefertari could not remember when she last drank water. Her lips were cracked like broken clay. Every breath felt sharp, as if the air itself wanted to hurt her. She tried to move, but was pressed against her skin from every side. Rough, splintered, tight. She was inside a cage, not a prison made of stone, not a cell with walls and guards. A wooden cage, left alone in the desert. Once, servants bowed when she walked past. Perfume followed her steps. Gold rings rested on her fingers. People whispered her name with respect. Now, flies whispered around her face instead. Her knees were pulled to her chest. Her back was bent. The cage was so small she could not stand, not lie down, not even stretch her arms. Every movement punished her again. The sun pressed harder as the day grew older. Sweat soaked her thin clothes, then dried, then burned her skin. She wanted to scream, but her voice was gone. In the distance, the desert was quiet. Too quiet. No guards. No mercy. No explanation. Just endless sand and endless waiting. Nefertari did not know how many days she had already spent there. She only knew one thing. This punishment was not meant to kill her quickly. It was designed to make her disappear slowly. And long before her body would fail, her mind already was. Before the cage, before the desert, before the pain, Nefertari lived a life that many women could only dream of. She woke each morning on soft linen sheets that smelled of lotus flowers. Sunlight entered her room through tall stone windows, touching painted walls covered with bright colors. Blue skies, green fields, golden gods. Servants moved quietly around her, careful not to disturb her rest. When she opened her eyes, water was already waiting. Clean, cool, blessed. Nefertari was 24 years old, young and admired. She was the wife of a high-ranking official, a man trusted by the palace and feared by those below him. His power became her shelter. In public, she walked beside him with her head high, dressed in fine linen, gold resting on her neck and wrists. People stepped aside when she passed. Some bowed, some looked away. She believed this life was permanent. She believed walls were strong enough to protect her from fate. Her days were filled with calm routines. She supervised servants, visited temples, and shared meals filled with bread, fruit, honey, and meat. At night, music echoed through halls, and oil lamps painted warm shadows on stone. She laughed easily then. She spoke without fear. But power in ancient Egypt was like the desert wind, could change direction without warning. The trouble did not arrive loudly. There was no knock on the door, no warning shout, no chance to run. One evening, as the sun fell red behind the city, soldiers entered their home. Their faces were hard, unreadable. They did not look at her with respect. They did not bow. They read out an order written on papyrus, sealed with authority that could not be questioned. Her husband was accused. The crime was never explained clearly. Words like betrayal, dishonor, disobedience floated through the air, heavy and dangerous. In Egypt, guilt did not stop with one person. Punishment spread like fire. That night, Nefertari was not allowed to pack her things. Her jewelry was taken. Her fine clothes were removed. Rough fabric replaced silk. The servants who once rushed to help her now stood frozen, afraid to speak. She looked for her husband. He was already gone, dragged away. She never saw him again. As she was led through dark streets, her feet bare against cold stone, fear finally reached her heart. Not fear of pain, but fear of the unknown. In Egypt, the law was not about fairness. It was about order, about example, about warning others what happens when the balance is disturbed. Nefertari was not judged in a court. She was selected to suffer. As the city disappeared behind her and the desert opened wide ahead, she still believed this was a mistake, that someone would speak up, that truth would matter. She did not yet understand. Mercy was not part of the punishment, and the desert was already waiting for her. The first time Nefertari saw the cage, she thought it was a cruel joke. It was small, too small for a woman to sit comfortably, too tight for her to lie down fully. Its wood was rough, splintered, and smelled of old smoke. Nails protruded in places, cutting into the palms of her hands when she tried to touch the bars. The cage had no roof for shade, no soft ground for rest. Only sand that burned under the sun and scraped her skin through her thin linen. 2 men shoved her inside. Her knees bent painfully, her back pressed against the wood. She tried to struggle, tried to speak, but her voice was swallowed by the desert wind. Once they locked the cage door with a heavy iron latch, they left without a word. She was alone. The sun was still high, pressed down on her body like a living thing, relentless and cruel. Every movement made her sweat. Every movement made her skin sting. Time lost meaning. Hours and days merged into a single, unbearable stretch of heat. At first, Nefertari tried to scream. She banged her fists on the bars. She shouted at the sky. Her cries were swallowed by sand and wind. No one came. No one listened. Hunger came first. Her stomach ached as she imagined food she could no longer reach. Dates, bread, roasted meat. Water came second. Her lips split, and her tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth. She could feel her throat tightening, her body begging for even a sip of water. Then came the flies, small, buzzing insects that crawled over her skin, around her eyes, into her hair. She swatted, but they returned. Their presence made her skin itch, made her feel trapped not just in the cage but inside her own body. Sleep was a distant memory. Every time she closed her eyes, the heat seemed to follow her, burning her from the inside out. Every time she shifted her body to find comfort, the cage reminded her that movement was a punishment. Nefertari began to talk to herself, whispered words at first, then longer sentences, stories of her past, memories of laughter in cool halls, of her husband's touch, of fragrant oils on her skin. The cage forced her to relive every small joy she had ever known and contrast it with the misery she now endured. Night brought little relief. The desert grew cold, sharp against her overheated skin. The wind howled, carrying the scent of sand and decay. She curled into herself, shivering and burning at the same time, trapped in a prison made for no human being. And then, slowly, the reality sank in. This cage was not temporary. This desert was endless. This punishment was designed to erase her body first, mind second. Each day, Nefertari's strength faded. Her muscles cramped. Her hands bled from touching the rough wood. Her feet swelled, pressed against splintered bars. But the worst suffering was not physical. It was the quiet, crushing knowledge that no one would come. No one would save her, no one would care. She began to watch the horizon, a line of heat waves that danced like fire over sand. She imagined herself walking toward it, imagining a world beyond the suffering. But every step, every thought of escape, was crushed by the weight of iron and wood and an unrelenting sun. Nefertari realized that the desert itself had become part of her punishment. Its emptiness echoed the emptiness growing inside her chest. Its silence reflected the silence of the people who once served her. She had been powerful once, but here, in the cage, she was nothing. Days became indistinguishable from nights, or perhaps nights were just darker days. Nefertari had stopped trying to count. Time had lost all meaning, replaced by an endless cycle of hunger, thirst, and pain. Her body ached in ways she had never imagined. Her knees swelled from being bent so long. Her back throbbed. Her skin burned under the relentless sun, then stiffened under the cold desert wind. But worse than the physical suffering was the slow erosion of her mind. First, she tried to reason. It will end, she told herself. Someone will notice. Someone will rescue me. But days passed and no one came. She spoke to herself more often, asking questions she already knew the answers to. Why me? How did I deserve this? Did my husband know what would happen to me? She began imagining things. Shadows in the sand that moved like people. Whispers in the wind that sounded like voices calling her name. Sometimes she swore she felt hands brushing her hair, touching her arms. But when she looked, there was nothing. Nothing but endless desert. Nothing but the cage that held her like a coffin. Memories became sharper in her mind. Faces of people she loved. Laughter from a life that felt more like a dream than reality. She remembered the sweetness of fruit on her tongue, the smoothness of her linen sheets, the smell of her husband's cologne. And she hated those memories because they reminded her of everything she had lost. Sleep was a cruel trick. When she did finally close her eyes, she saw visions of cages within cages, endless and suffocating, stretching beyond her sight. She dreamed of water slipping from her hands, of bread crumbling to dust before she could eat it. Every dream was punishment, every thought another lash of the whip. Even her sense of self began to crumble. Who was Nefertari if not a woman in a cage? The name she had once held proudly, whispered by servants and nobles alike, now felt like a lie. Her identity had been stripped with every splintered bar, every sun-scorched day, every silent night. She tried to pray to the gods. She whispered pleas into the wind. Is there no justice? Is there no mercy? But the gods remained silent. The sun moved across the sky without compassion. The desert stretched out in endless, indifferent waves. In her isolation, Nefertari began to feel a strange connection to the cage itself, as if it were alive. It was cruel, yes, but it was consistent. It never left her, never lied. The wooden bars were sharper than any human blade, yet they held her in a predictable, relentless rhythm of pain. She realized she could count on the cage when she could no longer count on anyone else. Then, one day, or perhaps it was night, she no longer knew, the breaking point came. She tried to cry, but the tears would not flow. She tried to scream, but her throat felt hollow. She pressed her face to the wood and whispered, I am nothing. I am nothing. I am nothing. And in that moment, the desert seemed to nod in agreement. Nefertari understood the cruel truth. This punishment was not just for her body. It was designed to crush her mind completely, to make her forget the warmth of home, the taste of food, the sound of a loved one's voice. By the time her body failed, her mind would already be gone. And so, trapped in a desert prison that no one would ever see, Nefertari waited. Not for rescue, not for justice, but for the end of herself. The sun had become her jailer, its rays sharper than any whip, its presence inescapable. Every morning, Nefertari woke with her skin scorched, her muscles stiff, her eyes heavy with sleepless exhaustion. The cage seemed smaller each day, pressing against her body as if it were alive, remembering her shape and mocking her struggle. Hunger gnawed relentlessly. Small grains of sand mixed with the dried sweat on her lips. She had long since imagined the taste of bread, of figs, of fresh water, only to remember that such things were impossible now. She licked her cracked lips and spat out the bitter taste of dust. Her stomach twisted painfully, screaming for food, yet she could do nothing but suffer. Thirst was worse. Each time she imagined a cup of water, a river, a pool of clear liquid, it felt like a blade through her chest. She licked her tongue and felt the dryness cracking inside her mouth. Her lips peeled, and her tongue felt stuck, heavy as stone. She whispered prayers into the wind, praying to gods she had long abandoned in her heart. No reply came, only silence. The desert became a companion in her misery. During the day, the sand shimmered and shimmered, waves of heat rising in the air, making her vision blur. At night, the temperature dropped suddenly, a cold she could not escape. Her skin burned in the sun and ached in the cold. The wind swept through the cage, scratching at her raw skin, blowing grit into her eyes and nose. She was not alone in her suffering. Tiny creatures, ants, flies, scorpions, found their way into her cage. Their presence made her skin crawl. She swatted, but they returned. Their endless buzzing and crawling became a symbol of the world she could no longer touch, the life she had been ripped from. Loneliness pressed as heavily as the bars themselves. She tried to remember the faces of her family, of her friends, of her husband. They were blurred now, fading like old frescoes. She spoke to them in whispers, telling them stories of what had been, but even the words sounded hollow. Her mind began to invent sounds, footsteps approaching, voices calling her name, soldiers laughing or perhaps mocking her. She strained her ears, only to hear the empty wind. The silence became a roar in her head, deafening in its cruelty. Her body weakened, and with weakness came hallucinations. She imagined water spilling into the cage, a table filled with food, shadows moving across the sand. Sometimes, she thought she saw her husband, reaching for her through the bars. But when she lunged, it was always the empty desert. One day, she realized she had stopped trying to resist. She did not struggle when the sun beat down. She did not cry when the wind tore at her. She merely existed, a shell pressed into wood and sand, waiting for something she could not name. The cage had won. The desert had won. Her hope had disappeared like the distant mirages on the horizon. Nefertari understood then that punishment in ancient Egypt was not always about death. It was about erasure, about stripping every part of a person, their body, their mind, their very identity, until nothing recognizable remained. She no longer counted days. She no longer imagined rescue. She only measured suffering. And in the depths of her despair, she began to accept that this might be her life forever. Trapped, broken, and forgotten. Weeks, perhaps months, Nefertari no longer knew, passed in the cage. The heat of the day and the cold of the night blurred into a single endless torment. Her body had weakened to the point that even small movements were painful. Her knees ached constantly from being bent for so long. Her back felt as if it had been shattered. Every bruise, every blister, every cut from the rough wood burned with a memory she could never forget. Hunger and thirst had become companions she could no longer escape. The small rations, brought perhaps once a week by distant servants of the officials, were barely enough to keep her alive. Water was a luxury she could not remember the taste of clearly. Sometimes, she would lick the condensation that formed on the wood at night, only to realize it was salt from her own sweat, bitter and burning. Her mind had started to betray her. She could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was imagined. She swore she saw shadows moving along the desert dunes at night, figures watching her from the distance, whispering her name. But every time she strained her eyes to see clearly, there was nothing. Only the shifting sands, indifferent and empty. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it brought no relief. Dreams became twisted versions of her past life. She would walk through familiar halls, smell her favorite perfumes, touch soft sheets, but every time, the dream would shatter. Floors would collapse, walls would turn to sand, her husband would vanish, leaving her alone. She would wake screaming, her throat raw, her eyes swollen. Even her thoughts began to feel heavy, like chains around her mind. Memories that once gave her comfort now tormented her. She remembered the laughter of her friends, the music in the palace halls, the warmth of her husband's embrace. And she hated herself for longing for it, for remembering a life that seemed cruelly distant. But the most terrifying part was the silence. Not the quiet of peace, but the silence that screamed. No guards came to check her. No one called her name. The world had forgotten she existed. And slowly, Nefertari began to realize that survival itself had become a curse. Each breath she drew, each painful heartbeat, reminded her that she was trapped, suffering, and alone, and that there was no end in sight. Occasionally, she tried to speak to the empty desert. She cried, yelled, begged the gods for release. Sometimes, she imagined that the wind responded, whispering back in ancient words she could not understand. But it was always the wind alone. No mercy ever came. Her body had adapted to some degree. Her mind hardened in strange ways. She learned how to sit in pain, how to move carefully to avoid cutting herself on the splintered wood, how to endure heat and cold without giving in to despair completely. But she was no longer Nefertari, the proud, noble woman. She was a shadow, a living ghost, a body imprisoned while the mind slowly unraveled. It was clear to her now. The cage, the desert, the punishment itself was not just to hurt her. It was to erase her from history, from memory, from the world itself. Those who survived this treatment were rare, and even when they did, their spirits were broken beyond repair. And yet, even in the darkness, a spark of defiance lingered in Nefertari's heart. A question, a thought she dared not voice aloud. How much can one human endure before even the soul begins to crack? The answer was terrifyingly close, and yet, she still did not know. The sun was relentless, as always. The desert stretched endlessly, a sea of burning sand and shifting shadows. Nefertari's body was smaller now, her frame reduced to skin stretched over aching bones. Her hands were gnarled from gripping the bars for support. Her feet blistered and cracked. Every movement brought pain, yet still she moved, because stopping meant surrendering completely to nothingness. Her mind, too, had begun to fray entirely. Names, faces, memories, everything that had once defined her life, slipped away like water through a sieve. She could no longer recall the color of her favorite dress, the sound of music in the palace halls. Even her husband's face had become a blurred shadow. Only the cage remained real. Only the desert remained real. Only the unbearable, unending suffering remained real. Yet, in this hollowed mind, a strange clarity arose. She realized that the cage had not just held her body, it had held her life. Every second of agony was part of a deliberate design, crafted to erase her, piece by piece, until nothing of Nefertari remained in the world. The wind shifted that day, or perhaps it had always been shifting. Sand swirled into the cage, biting at her skin, forcing her to shield her face. She felt the cage groan and tremble, the wood weakening under the heat and time. And in that moment, something inside her broke completely. She stopped thinking about the past, stopped clinging to memories, stopped longing for rescue. She simply existed, suspended between pain and nothingness, her identity dissolving like dust in the wind. Time had lost all meaning. Days merged into nights, nights merged into silence. She no longer spoke, no longer moved beyond the minimum to survive. Her body was nothing more than a tool for enduring the desert's cruelty, her mind a hollow echo of what once was. Occasionally, the sun would set, painting the sky with blood-red streaks. Nefertari would watch, feeling neither hope nor despair, only the simple, empty awareness of being alive in the cage. The beauty of the world, once vivid and intoxicating, had become a faint memory, distant and meaningless. And then, as the sun rose one final time, the cage's weakened wood gave way. The desert swallowed her quietly, without celebration or witness. There was no scream, no final struggle, no triumphant escape. Nefertari had vanished, not with a blaze of glory, not with a sigh of relief, but in the quiet, relentless erasure of a life extinguished by cruelty. The desert continued its endless dance of heat and sand. The wind whispered over dunes, over empty cages, over forgotten lives. Those who survived similar punishments bore scars that went beyond the flesh. They carried the memory of erasure, the knowledge that in ancient Egypt, justice could be a slow, invisible death. It was not just about punishment, it was about disappearing, being stripped of everything that made one human, until the world forgot the person ever existed. Nefertari's story was not unique. Countless others had suffered the same fate. Lives ended not with blood and spectacle, but with silent oblivion. The cage, the desert, the relentless sun, all tools in a system designed to remind the living that power and mercy were illusions. And so, as the desert stretched on, vast and indifferent, Nefertari became a whisper carried by the wind. A warning, a memory, a chilling reminder of the most disgusting punishment ever devised. One that destroyed not only the body, but the soul itself.